right? Because I know we're time pressured and people are going to be coming in for the next couple of minutes. I'm just going to talk about our agenda now. Normally we start with an inspirational and spiritual message, but because our speaker, our educational speaker, not that both of them are not educational, Emily Wirzba from EDF can only stay until 6:30. We're going to start with her. We're going to, and then we'll have questions and answers, and then we're going to end with a send-off, an inspirational spiritual send-off from Melinda. So just so that you know. So Emily is going to talk for a few minutes, and just to tell you who Emily is, she uses she, her pronouns, and she's the manager of government relations from EDF Action Fund, Environmental Defense Fund. And I've heard her speak before, and she's honest and very knowledgeable. So why don't you get started with your little overview of what's happening, and then just fill us in as we need to be filled in. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to get to talk with you all a little bit tonight. A lot is happening, but I think first it's important to note that we still have this really critical window of time to make a difference and influence the conversation in Congress. So, and there's still some good reasons for hope, although the situation is very fluid. So in a lot of ways, this meeting is perfectly timed for your all's advocacy. So just to begin, as you all know, there are kind of two main bills being talked about in Congress right now. The first is the bipartisan infrastructure bill. The second is the Democrat-only Build Back Better Act, also known as reconciliation. So quickly, this bipartisan infrastructure bill had a lot of really good initial investments in things like EV charging infrastructure, zero emission school buses, grid modernization, resiliency, a lot of good things, but should very much be seen as just the initial first step. Much more is needed to actually meet our decarbonization goals and help us meet our NDC at the International Climate Conference that's starting in just a few weeks in Glasgow. So, President Biden pledged to the international community that we'll reduce our emissions by at least 50 to 52% by 2030. That's a really big goal. And so congressional action is really like a crucial piece of helping us get there. So this first bipartisan infrastructure package that had some initial investments, that was passed by the Senate on a bipartisan basis. You got all Democrats plus 19 Republican senators to vote for it, which is really huge. But that bill has not yet been passed by the House. And part of that reason is because more of the House progressives are nervous that if the bipartisan bill passes the House without a commitment from the more moderate members of the House to move forward on this second Build Back Better Act, they're worried that the momentum would fall apart and we wouldn't actually get this second bill through, which contains a lot of the more major investments in climate, among many other important policy issues. So there's been a lot of back and forth over the past few months on this. The latest deadline that Congress is working with is October 31st. And that is because this bipartisan infrastructure bill included a lot of transportation provisions because our surface transportation reauthorization bill needed to get kind of redone and passed again. So Congress, a few weeks ago, when they couldn't come up with a deal, they decided to pass a temporary extension of our kind of existing surface transportation funding. So technically that runs out October 31st, which is why the House is trying to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill by then. But they won't have the votes from progressives until they get an outline kind of and a more firm kind of idea of what will be included in this Build Back Better Act. So that's where the kind of the bulk of the conversation has been focused right now. So initially, the Build Back Better Act was going to include several really core climate provisions, and taken together with the climate provisions already included in the first infrastructure bill, it would actually help us get to 45% of our emissions reductions as a country by 2030. So not quite 50%, but almost there to President Biden's pledge. But there's a fear of that being weakened now. So initially, we were going to see a clean electricity payment program, which would pay utilities for using more clean energy. We were going to see a really robust suite of clean energy, transportation, and manufacturing tax credits to help with deployment of renewable energy, of electric vehicles and EV charging infrastructure, and the manufacturing of clean energy batteries here in the US, we were going to see things like a methane fee on methane pollution. We are going to see investments in a clean energy accelerator, which is kind of like a green bank of sorts, something called the Civilian Climate Corps, which would be a huge public works and jobs program for young people. So there are all these kind of core provisions that we were hoping to see. And Democrats originally were hoping this bill would be $3.5 trillion worth kind of a programs that would be paid for through various means that have not yet been agreed upon. So as you all have been reading over the past few weeks, that several senators have come out and said $3.5 trillion is too much. And so knowing that that's going to have to get scaled down to a smaller number, that's probably going to be in between 1.5 trillion and 2 trillion. The question is, well, what falls out, right? What do they do? Do they keep all the programs in and just fund them at smaller levels? Or do they kind of throw entire programs out and just kind of robustly fund a few core things? Because it's way more than just climate in this bill. There's things around poverty, around healthcare, around immigration. Like it's a really massive, this is Biden's core policy agenda. So yesterday, so I should say, you know, we've had senators come out and say they want a smaller overall number. We've also started to have senators come out and talk about specific programs that they don't like. So one of those programs over the weekend was Senator Manchin saying he actually is not supportive of this clean electricity payment program in its current form. And that would actually have to be written by his committee that he leads. So he has a lot of control over that. This was something that a lot of people in the environmental community have been working on for many weeks. So it was not good news, but I think the thing that we keep coming back to is that the climate provisions overall remain a top priority for Democrats across the political spectrum. So you have even more moderate Democrats like Senator Sinema or Stephanie Murphy, who's a moderate Democrat from Florida, coming out and saying, look, the climate stuff is the most important. So we want to find ways to pay for everything else, but the climate stuff is actually the only things that we're okay with just paying for without kind of finding a way to make up that revenue. So specifically, we know that the clean energy and transportation and manufacturing tax credits are a huge priority for everyone across the board, and that includes Senator Manchin. So this is something that will drive major investments to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's really, really important policy. Obviously, that's not enough. So what we're pushing for is, okay, like let's say this clean electricity payment program, the CEPP, if you don't like that, what are other options on the table to help make up that emissions reductions gap, right? Because the most important thing that this bill does is actually drive our emissions reductions down so we can meet our decarbonization goals. So another kind of policy option that's been talked about in recent weeks would be a price on carbon. Could you, maybe that would be across all sectors of the economy. Maybe it would be just focused on particular sectors. There's a lot of different proposals being thrown about that we've been hearing about. That's another backstop to ensure that we could be on track to reducing our emissions. We've also, heard over the weekend that there might be certain senators who aren't okay with that policy either. But I would say it's not none of these policies are completely dead. I think there's just a lot of kind of behind the scenes negotiating that's happening right now about what changes to them these senators would accept. So what happened yesterday is that there were two meetings at the White House, one with the moderates and one with the progressives. And both sides actually left those meetings with the White House feeling pretty optimistic. I think both sides know that they're going to be needing to make some compromises, but it looks like this overall number will be maybe between 1.7 and 1.9 trillion dollars. So they're kind of starting to hone in on a number. They're starting to hone in on kind of what the core policies are that they'll include. And so this is kind of a lot of like in the weeds behind the scenes stuff that's happening, but basically Congress is trying to come up with enough of a framework for what this Build Back Better Act will include, what the dollar amount will be, what it's going to look like. If they can have enough of that kind of outline agreed upon and supported by progressives and moderates, then the goal is to try to do that by October 31st, because if they can do that, then there's a chance that the House can go ahead and pass this bipartisan infrastructure bill, kind of check that as complete, and then fully turn their attention to writing and passing this Build Back Better Act. And I think what's tricky about it too is that the margins in both the House and the Senate are so slim that in the Senate, they can't lose a single Democratic vote. And in the House, they can only afford to lose 3. So they really have to keep, any individual member has a ton of power right now, which just makes this a little bit complicated. So I think what maybe the way to kind of summarize and wrap up is that I think we're in this critical moment where the next few days, the next week and a half, is a major deadline to figure out what will the actual climate provisions look like, and what's how large will this bill end up being. But I think the important message from constituents to be bringing to your Senator Casey, Senator Toomey won't be voting for the bill, but it doesn't hurt to talk to him, but focusing on Senator Casey and then focusing on your representatives and letting them know that kind of regardless of where they land on what the climate provisions look like, it's really the most important thing is that they're transformational enough and large enough to actually help us meet our commitment to the international community of reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030. So really honing in on look, even, policies might fall in and out, but what's most important is that whatever the final package looks like, it's going to help us meet those goals. So my best advice for you all in the next week, if you can, phone calls into your offices, letting them know that this is your top priority and why it's so important. If you are able to get a meeting with the staff, a virtual meeting even with the staff of your representatives or senator, that's also a really, really great way to kind of tell them why you care about it, how you're seeing these issues impact your community, and why now you think is the moment to really take action. So that was a lot of information, and I probably missed things and left things out. So maybe we can just do questions and have some discussion.
Paul had a question. Do you know if the proposals for a carbon fee include a dividend paid back to citizens?
Great question. That is definitely on the table, but they have not finalized what that would look like. So what we know is that they're very actively talking about a carbon price. We don't really have a great sense of what the specifics are in terms of revenue use. And I think that's because they're kind of trying to figure out, well, what will actually help get 50 votes. But from the best intel that I can gather, what I've heard is that there'll probably be a large portion used to be returned to citizens as dividends, partially because President Biden has pledged not to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. And the White House is really sticking to that pledge. And so by using some of the money for a dividend, that could help make that case that you're not actually harming consumers, you're helping to keep them whole. We've also heard that some funding might be used for worker transition assistance, kind of people in this concept of a just transition. So helping those workers who will be impacted by kind of this shift in our energy economy. So that's another critical piece. And I think that's especially a critical message for Pennsylvania. I know Senator Casey is deeply concerned about kind of how a policy like this would affect the fossil fuel workers in the state. And so hoping if some of the revenue could be used for that, I think that might be an interesting opening. But we also know that there are particular senators who would be interested in using the revenue from a carbon tax to help offset the cost of the overall package. So to use it as a pay for. So it could be any combination of those 3 things. Or something else, who knows, but those are all kind of ideas being talked about right now.
So there was a question from Kathy. She said, and she apologizes for being late, but it's worth it to reiterate this. What are some of the specific strategies to save money that will be if we must cut back in the act in order to pass it? So what's in, what's out, if you could just summarize it. And there were some other things that you haven't mentioned, and if you could go into some of those details.
Yes, so I think, sorry, I'm just reading the question again. In terms of energy efficiency or specific programs overall that we think will be cut out.
Kathy?
Oh, you're unmuting me, thanks. Any of the strategies that might be implemented to save energy, such as energy efficiency, or outside of the energy plan that's being rejected by Manchin?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I guess, how are we going to make up for that?
In terms of like reducing emissions and acting on
Correct.
climate?
Yeah. How are we going to get the carbon footprint or get to net zero by 2030, 2040, or 2050 if we have to eliminate a big part of the act?
Yeah, so if the clean electricity payment program is completely removed, like there's a few things. Like one, they're debating if there's a new way they can write it that would generate support from Senator Manchin. Another option is to use a carbon tax, a price on carbon, as a way to reduce emissions and make up that gap. But again, we don't know if that will get the votes of all 50 senators. Other people are talking about kind of larger investments in different programs to fund clean energy deployment and different kind of research programs. So like there was a program kind of initially being talked about that would be $5 billion to help electrify heavy duty trucks, which is a super important piece of, right? Our transportation sector is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So maybe instead of 5 billion for this program, you could double that or triple that, right? So there are lots of different things that people are trying to think about. And I don't think there's a really one clear answer yet. That's just what everyone is kind of brainstorming and trying to figure out like what that would look like and how we can do it.
So Nancy says she knows it's late, but how can we get the media to cover what's included instead of centering on Manchin?
It's a great question. I think part of the problem is that they haven't decided what's included yet, which makes it really hard. The media loves to focus on this kind of the partisanship or like the drama and the back and forth, but it's a little bit hard to talk about substance when we don't fully know what's going to be included. But I think my hope is that that kind of the media can continue to lift up that this will be a transformational piece of legislation, and rather than focusing on the things that were cut or left out, hopefully this final package will still help us achieve our greenhouse gas goals. And so being able to focus on that, how that's a win, and talking about all the good things that are in the bill once they finalize it will be really important, because I think, let's say they do pass a bill that's $1.9 trillion, includes massive investments in clean energy tax credits, among a whole bunch of other grant programs that actually will help us stay on track to achieve our goals. We want the media narrative to be celebrating how exciting this moment is, rather than focusing on all the infighting and all the things that they try to do that then were cut out. So kind of lifting up the positives, I think will be really important. But in order to get to a place where we can do that, we need to make sure that the bill kind of stays on track and actually is robust enough to help us meet those goals.
Is the money for agriculture being contested by anybody, or people pretty much supporting that?
I have not heard any specifics on that. So as far as my knowledge, that's been okay.
And how about forests?
So similar, I haven't heard anything, but it's not an issue that I focus on. So.
And how about the National Climate Bank?
So that's another one where I think I haven't heard. It's like the things that you haven't heard are being under attack. That's usually a good sign, because it means it's kind of flying under the radar. And so based off of, a month or so ago, the House kind of wrote their version of the Build Back Better Act at $3.5 trillion. And we know that some of what's included in that will get shrunk down, but that version did include a clean energy accelerator, which is like a national green bank to help fund clean energy projects. So I haven't heard anything otherwise, but I think my advice is that if that's, any of these programs that are really important to you all, that in your engagement with your congressional delegation, that you're saying, these are some of the things that we want to make sure we see included.
So Marianne's question is a question that is an important question for other than Marianne. Her representative is on the right. Is it still important for her to be contacting him?
I think so. I think you should know that he won't vote for the bill. We're not expecting any Republicans to vote for the Build Back Better Act. But on the House side, they're still going to vote on this bipartisan infrastructure bill. And that might be a place worth going to him and saying, hey, they're going to have this vote in a few weeks. I really hope that you'll vote for it. And you can point to the fact that it is a bipartisan bill. that it had the support of 19 Republican senators, which is a huge deal, and that includes a lot of really good policies for the state. And so I think it's still worth having a conversation. I always think that if these members of Congress don't ever hear from their constituents that they care about this issue, it's really easy for them to just dismiss it and say, well, why should I care about climate change if I don't hear from anybody on it? So I think it's always worth having that conversation. But just know that he won't vote for the Build Back Better Act.
Kathy, yes, anything about it for education and energy and water efficiency?
Sorry, so can you repeat those issues again? For
Energy, education in energy and water efficiency.
So I'm not sure. I know that the bipartisan infrastructure bill included a lot of funding for water program, for clean water, for energy efficiency, and for like a number of other like energy related programs. One of the things that was included in the bipartisan bill was some funding to replace lead service lines to help with clean drinking water. There's been talk of increasing that amount of funding in this second Build Back Better Act because what was included in the first one isn't enough. But I'm not sure where the status of that is in terms of negotiations. I think this Build Back Better Act initially was going to contain a lot more funding for workforce development programs, so education and job training, not just for this Civilian Climate Corps program, but also for some other kind of job training programs. But again, that's been one of the things in recent days that has been talked about as potentially shrinking in terms of funding because they have to, cut this bill almost in half, if not by more. And so thinking about those programs that you care about again and being able to name those to your members of Congress.
So are you saying that the Civilian Conservation or Climate Corps may or may not exist or just be smaller?
Either option's on the table. And I feel like I keep saying that I don't know. It's very unsatisfying for me too. We like have multiple calls a week with consultants and even with Senate staff, and they'll say they're still trying to decide on the strategy. So again, as I mentioned, there's kind of two schools of thought that even people like Nancy Pelosi are still trying to figure out. One option is they keep all the programs in the bill. They just cut the funding. They just shrink the size of the funding, but they get those programs established. Maybe they're funded for a year or two, and they're kind of hedging this bet that Republicans will extend them if kind of control of Congress switches. But then there's this other school of thought that says that's risky. We should just fully fund for 10 years particular programs that are the most important. And so we still don't know which path Congress is going to choose. My guess is that it'll be a mixture of both. And so as an example, I just pulled this up. It's not related to climate necessarily, but it should give you an idea. So like one of the programs they're talking about is the child tax credit. And so they're thinking maybe rather than fully funding it for 10 years, we'll leave it in because it's so important, but we'll only fund it for another year or two. So that's like an example, just to give that they're kind of trying to figure out which programs are important to still establish, even if it's at a smaller level.
Any other questions?
May I voice a question rather than write it?
Of course.
Okay. It just takes me a little while to write it. I was wondering in that last bit, if we're going to lessen the programs, the talk is about lessening the programs or lessening the money to all the programs or something like that. Is there anyone who is very clearly pitting kind of the climate aspect of the act against the poverty and health aspects of? Is that so? And who's using it, and how do we kind of meet that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think the good news for climate is that has remained a top priority for all Democrats. I haven't heard any Democrats, moderate or progressive, saying these other things are more important than climate. I think most members have like a couple of core priorities, but I think it's a really good sign that even some of the more moderate members who maybe are more skeptical on spending large amounts of money for some of these other healthcare or poverty programs, they're all in on climate. That's like remains a priority. And even Senator Manchin, the clean energy and transportation tax credits remain a core priority of his. So I think there's a lot of room still to have robust climate action in this bill, because that's like the one thing that everyone can agree on is that this is really important. It's just the details of what that looks like.
So you haven't mentioned one elephant in the room. Yeah, Harris, I'll call you in a second. And that's the other Democratic senator.
Senator Sinema.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think she's an interesting example where she's kind of disagreeing with her party on some of the pharmaceutical and prescription drug issues and how you pay for things like raising the corporate tax rate. But she is one of those members who's come out and said climate is a core priority of hers in this bill. And so that's one area that she really wants to support and thinks should be prioritized regardless of how it's paid for. So that's to me optimistic. I think the tricky thing is that all of these members are getting so much media attention, and they're getting hounded by reporters everywhere they go. And I think people really want to know, like, where exactly are you on these programs, what you support. But I think we have to, my advice is that I myself am guilty of like getting caught up in like the latest quotes from all these people, but just knowing that that the conversations are ongoing behind the scenes, and that we have to just keep bringing our message to our members of Congress and kind of trust that those will get through.
So you said earlier that we should be phone calling. And if we could possibly get a meeting with them, we should do that. So you want to talk a little bit about, how do you arrange a meeting? How many people, that type of stuff? Because I'm sure most of us have not arranged their own meetings.
Yeah, so a couple different ways. One, on the website of your member of Congress, they have contact information. Sometimes they have a form if you want to like request a meeting officially through their website. Sometimes they'll list the office number. So you can call your district office and you can just say that you are a constituent and that you would love to set up a meeting with somebody on staff to talk about the climate change priorities in the bill. And then they might do a virtual meeting. A lot of offices are still doing that. Some are doing in person, just really small numbers. So anywhere from like two to 5 can be a good number. And what you do if you get a chance to have a conversation like that, even if it's brief, is just to kind of identify yourself, talk about where you're from in the state, kind of what your community is, if you're part of associations or different groups or congregations, and then kind of start by kind of thanking them for taking the time to meet with you, thanking them for something a recent vote, if you can find something that you agree with, and then kind of leading with your main ask of like what it is you're hoping they'll do in terms of the programs they'll support and the priority they'll place on climate in reconciliation in this Build Back Better Act. And then you spend your time like basically telling your story, talking about why you care about climate change, how it's impacting you and your community. You don't have to feel like you have all the technical know-how of like what's going on in the bill, what are all the policy details, how does it work? That's okay, that's not your job to know. They want to know why you care about it as their constituent. And so I think it can be a really valuable thing to do. And often members of Congress will listen to these stories and they'll use them as they're voting. That'll be like the reminder for why they take these votes and positions that they do. And so it's really a wonderful way of like putting democracy into action and making your voice heard. So I highly recommend if you're able to do that. It's a kind of great another advocacy tool. Another one I'll just briefly mention is if any of you write letters to the editor in your local newspapers, it could be a really great time to write a brief note to your paper about why you care about climate change in this bill, and that if you actually mention your member of Congress by name in the letter to the editor, they're most likely going to see it because they have communication staff whose job it is to like round up all the press clips that they're mentioned in. So it's another great way to kind of make your voice heard and kind of educate your broader community as well.
And especially if your representative is not on the side of this already, and if you live outside of metropolitan areas, those letters to the editor really hold a lot of weight in your local newspapers. So we've taken up more time than I bargained for with you, Emily. Thank you so much. You were so informative. And hopefully in a couple of weeks, we'll be together to celebrate. So
Yes.
thank you
Well, and
so much.
thank you all. I'm so grateful for your advocacy and that you all are paying attention to this right now. And I really do. I know that it can feel really hopeless and like lots of doom and gloom and uncertainty. And but just know that we have this real opportunity. I've been working on this stuff for almost a decade, and this is the first chance we actually have to pass comprehensive climate policy. It's a huge moment, and so keep up the hope. And really excited to see how this plays out. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. So what I thought we would do now is that we could unmute and people could ask questions of, or even state what are they doing, how can they get involved, any questions that they have about phone calls, letters to the editor. Between us, I'm sure we have enough expertise to be able to answer questions, letters to the editor, phone calls, meetings with representatives, etc.
Anybody want to organize in my area to go see our representatives, or do you think it's worth it for us to do that?
I met
Phyllis?
with Casey 2 weeks in a row. Casey's aide 2 weeks in a row. I don't feel comfortable myself in organizing another meeting with Casey. But representatives, I think it would be really appropriate. You're in Scanlon's district, right?
Right.
Tara, you're also in Scanlon's district, right? And Joyce,
Yes.
you're in Scanlon's too. So we have 3 people here who are in Scanlon's. Anybody else in Scanlon's district?
I am. This is Nancy.
Okay, so there's 4. Would any of you be willing to go on her website and try to get a meeting with Scanlon? I mean, we know she's a supporter, but she needs to hear from her people that this is important to us and that she needs a little tap on the back too, a little support on her back.
Sure.
Was that you, Isabel, who was the organizer? Great. Okay, so you got the names, Nancy and Tara Radden, and I can give you her email, and Joyce, and I can give you her email also. That would be wonderful. Any other ideas about what people are going to do?
Can you give me a sense? I know this is not what we're going to do, but I have written and called Senator Casey a number of times, and it's the first time I haven't gotten a response from him. Instead of, signing a petition or something like that, I wrote a letter. So I know that he's very supportive of the Conservation Corps, and generally he's supportive of this. But do you know what, from your meetings with his staff, do you have any idea of how strong his support is?
Casey?
Mm-hmm.
Super, and I mean, he was one of the supporters of one of the sponsors of the Conservation Climate Corps.
Yes, I know that.
Casey's not going to go against the party. We know that, but he's not also going to be a huge leader.
Yeah, that's been my sense.
Yeah, but I personally think that they're so inundated with pressure from every group that's there, whether it's housing or childcare credits or whatever, that I don't think the staff can keep up. I do know the staff are recording it though. Okay. And Joan, you had a question or a comment.
Yes, I had a comment. I'm Joan Bouchard and I live in State College. So I'm kind of in a different area from, I think, most of the people who are on this call. I just wanted to make a general comment about writing letters to the editor, because and on the statewide level, Jake Corman is our senator and he is a lost cause.
Right.
We have gone to see him. We have written to him. He doesn't really care because fossil fuels pay his campaign costs. So I have found, though, that the letters to the editor that people write mentioning his name, as well as the various things we would like him to do or are very regretful that he is doing, people talk about that a lot. And I live in congregate housing here at the village at Penn State. And we talk about these kinds of things frequently. So I do write letters to the editor on subjects that I don't think I'll get very far with my individual senator with, but that I know will gather ground level support for the next election. So I just wanted to say that is, if you think that you're particular, like Glenn Thompson, what are we going to do with Glenn Thompson? He doesn't have a green bone in his body. But on the other hand, when people write letters saying that, other people pay attention. And I'm hoping that he will not be reelected next time around. So that's what I wanted to say.
So
That's
you've
all.
gotten your letters published.
Oh, yes.
Kudos to you.
The CDT is the Center Daily Times. This is a small town newspaper. Everybody knows everybody else. I know the managing editor because she came out to the village at Penn State to talk. And she lets me know when it's going to be published. And if I have some things that either weren't totally factual or could be changed a bit to be more accurate, she'll let me know. So, you know, I don't live in Philadelphia or Lancaster or Pittsburgh or, you know, Allentown, Bethlehem. So not everybody can have that relationship, obviously, with their editor. But in a small town, yeah, and people all over, you know, people who live out in the community, you know, they read the letters to the editor every day. And if they don't get the printed edition, they get the digital edition and they talk about it. So I'm a big fan of writing letters to the editor.
Everybody says it's a super effective technique. So thank you. And thank you for your successes. Anybody else who lives outside of a metropolitan area who has a connection or even trying to connect with a small town newspaper who might be, I mean,
I would actually just say for those, Phyllis, your reaction to Joan surprised me because I live in Scranton and every letter to the editor that I've ever submitted has been published. So because
fabulous.
we have a little group of people who are kind of constant. There's only a small group of people who are writing letter to the editors, basically, letters to the editor. And so I was wondering, sometimes they even reach out and pull in from other places. Maybe they don't have enough submissions for that week. So I was thinking if any of you in more metropolitan areas submit to smaller towns, your voices could be heard at least beyond, I mean, for these national issues, if you want your words to be heard, go to some of these smaller papers, and they often don't have enough people, or they just want to hear a different voice because they keep kind of having the same complainers often are the ones who are, I mean, it's true. I mean, there's a lot of, so anyway, if you want to, at least if you're not having success in Harrisburg and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, etc., if you want to be heard, I would suggest writing to Scranton Times Tribune, go to State College, but there are a lot of different papers you could try.
That's great to hear, because I always thought you had to be within their district or their mailing address or anything like that.
I mean, for these
we have people from Florida and Maryland. Probably they lived in State College once upon a time, but they publish them and people read them too.
Same.
And there's also something called the Gazette, and the Gazette is something that's owned by statecollege.com, and basically it's one of these papers that makes its money on advertising revenue, and it's free. But they are looking for letters to the editor because, you know, they're looking for things that other people, other than, you know, the police blotter and, you know, what did the latest project at the library, what was that all about? So, you know, that's another thing to investigate if you have something like that in your area.
That's great. Thank you. I have had zero success getting anything published in Philadelphia newspapers and in the metropolitan area newspapers. So that's probably, Melinda, why I was so discouraging and so encouraging to Joan, because I have written, oh, I don't know, 25, 30 letters and I have zero published.
Oh, dear.
Do you think it's because of volume or the
No,
subject matter?
no, it's the fact that I don't have a connection. I don't have a title after my name, or I mean, they're interested in a political person. They're interested in somebody who has, you know, something that says I have the credential in this area. And it's not my opinion.
Okay. Well, Scranton, they'll take you no matter what.
But it's who you know, not what you know, because I made a point when the editor came out here to talk at the Village of Penn State, go up, introduce myself, talk to her, send her an email afterwards, make sure that I had her proper email address and so on and so forth. You know, you really have to cultivate somebody inside in order to be able to use that well in an area like Philadelphia. And Phyllis, you know, you may not know the right person, but somebody you know might know the right person. So, you know, that might possibly work, but that's discouraging. You know, I feel for you in that position.
Okay. Any other ideas? How often do people call their representatives? Do you think there's ever a point where you're just bugging them too much and they're like sick and tired of you?
When you're online, you can get 4 and 5 different organizations asking you to do the same thing on the same day at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll do it because I think the numbers matter, but it does get like, oh, wow, I just did this. Do I have to do this again?
Mhm.
That's how you feel.
Mhm.
But a lot of times you don't get a person in the office. You get a tape
Right.
because they're not in the office.
When I've written Casey recently, you know, I don't say, well, you're tired of hearing from me, but one of the things I always try to do with, particularly with him, is acknowledge what his positions are. Like, you know, just stroke him a little bit, and then say whatever I need to say. And it's not with Casey, it's not a matter of, well, he's come out against such and such. It's, I want him to push. I want him to, and as you said, he's not really a leader that way, but I mean, he was, I don't know. There are different ways, and it's not him reading it, it's his staff reading it. So
Right.
whatever they, you know, information they convey directly is probably just numbers and calls too.
Joan?
I've had some success because I made my living for a couple decades in insurance. I've had some success making sure that the person that answers the phone and runs the office knows who I am and knows that when I send her an email, that she will pass it along to her boss. And this, it hasn't worked at all with Jake Corman because he's an impossible case, but that gets the message to him. So if he weren't an impossible case, then that would have been a very effective strategy. So if you can somehow, or rather, you know, I happened to meet Brandy when I went with a couple of members of the Sierra Club to talk to Jake about the plastic bag ban, which he has been very successful with, unfortunately. But I got to know Brandy, and I know when I say something to her, I know she'll pass it along because we have a good relationship. So if there's any way to, you know, visit the person in his or her office, even if you meet with a staff member, if you can get a good relationship going with that staff member, you might even just carbon copy your senator or your representative and actually address the letter to the administrative assistant or the office manager. So when you sell insurance, you learn how to get to the decision maker. And that's a word to the wise for people who might not have ever been in that position. That works.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Thank you, Joan and Nancy and Joyce and Melinda for contributing expertise on how we can all get this past the finish line. And now I'd like to introduce Melinda, Dr. Melinda Crocus. She's the Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Philosophy and Religious Study in the Religious Studies Department at Marywood University or College? University.
University.
And she has a fascinating background, and I heard her speak at an IPL conference, and I just know she's going to be very inspirational and spiritual, no matter what she says. Even if she just says her name, she'll be inspirational and spiritual. So,
Thank you, Phyllis. Well, I've thought about what do I do in times like these when we're looking at this Build Back Better Act and certain things seem like they're slipping away. So important, this is our time and what to do. And I think Emily even said it when she starts getting caught up, right? And I can feel myself getting caught up. And if I don't do this, it's all going to fall apart. And it's like, if I just can talk to a few more people and if I can actually change a Republican's mind, I feel like that's possible, but no, it can't happen. And so I retreat with a couple of my favorite poets is usually what I do when I start feeling that anxiety. I am a Sufi Muslim, and so I've gone to Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi and my own Turkish order's main poet, Yunus Emre. And I kind of sit there and I go across time, I go across space and feel with them so I can maybe see more clearly or even have a more creative response than the anxiety that I'm actually finding myself in. I have creative response or approach or a solution. So I wanted to share just two short little poems. One, the first is from Mevlana Rumi. When compassion fills my heart, free from all desire, I sit quietly like the earth. My silent cry echoes like thunder throughout the universe. So I sat with that, being part of the universe. And then I moved on to Yunus. I always do them in tandem. They're kind of co-contemporaries. And Yunus writes, the entire universe turns in a whirling dance. Suns burn to your love. Love is our religion. We don't believe in any other. Mm-hmm. And before I've said with Phyllis, I sang the entire universe turns in a whirling dance and suns burn to your love. Sevgi bizim dinimizdir, başka dine inanmayız. Sevgi bizim dinimizdir, başka dine inanmayız. Love is our religion, and we don't believe in any other. So when I bring those two poets to Build Back Better, I try to think as the earthling I am in this whirling universe. And I think about what is build in Earth's terms, reaching down into your deepest self, simultaneously ancient and present, and grow accordingly for the future generations, building in Earth's terms. What is back? Resilient, recovering, bouncing back from being bent, stretched, and broken even. And better. What is better? Simply in alignment with knowledge, with that deepest self, Earth to the universe. Build back better in Earth's terms. I mean,
Thank you, Melinda. I think having you at the end was actually fabulous because it really got us grounded again in where we are and who we are and love and the earth and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to send us all off with two messages. The one was from Melinda of love and build back better and all the things that she talked about in terms of build the earth better, back, etc. And also Emily's message, and Emily's message that I think is so encouraging is if you haven't heard about it in the news, most likely it will be in part of the bill. So we keep hearing about what's not in, but we have to remember that moderate and liberal, progressive, Democratic congressmen and senators want to prioritize climate, and there's a lot that's still in the bill, and there's probably going to be more that could be in the bill because some large items have been taken out. So we have to have strength and courage, and we have to ground ourselves constantly. So thank you, Melinda, and thank you, Emily, who's not on the line anymore. But this to me was a very uplifting session in addition to very informative. So to all of you, I say thank you and keep up the excellent work. I'll be happy to support anybody in the things that they want to be doing. And amen.